Alhamdulillah, nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruhu wa natubu ilayhi wa na'udhu billahi min shururi anfusina wa min sayyiati a'malina. Man yahdihillahu fahuwal muhtad wa man yudlil falan tajida lahu waliyan murshida. Wa ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in his noble book, O you who believe, be conscious of Allah as he should indeed be conscious of, and do not die without faith in your heart. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in his Quran, يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا. He says, O you who believe, speak words of appropriate justice. When I chose to look at various translations of this ayah, I deliberately didn't want to pick the ones which will suit the topic of today's sermon and khutbah. But most translators have translated the words qawlan sadidan as appropriate justice. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu attaqullaha wa qawlan sadidan yusli lakum a'malakum wa yaghfir lakum dhunubakum wa man yuti'illah wa rasulahu faqad faza fawzan azim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, O you who believe, fear Allah and speak words of appropriate justice. The way the word appropriate justice is used in the Quran is very interesting. It says that we have to be very precise in the way we speak. And we speak in such a way that we do not violate the rights of anybody. We speak in such a way that our words do not commit injustice upon another. And I found in the Quran, and if you look at Surah Al-Ma'un, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the hypocrites who pray often to be seen as if they are praying, who go out there and pray in fashion where they are not very caring about their prayers, but they pray to be seen. But when the time comes to help the poor, they are not there. When the time comes to feed the poor, they are not there. They do not advocate for assistance to those who are orphans. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَرَأَيْتَ الَّذِي يُكَذِّبُ بِالدِّينِ فَذَلِكَ الَّذِي يَدُعُّ الْيَتِيمَ وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَىٰ طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ. And this line, وَلَا يَحُضُّ عَلَىٰ طَعَامِ الْمِسْكِينِ, they do not encourage the feeding of the poor. And that is the exact opposite of what we mean by qawlan sadida. It is the exact opposite of speaking with appropriate justice. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who believe, fear God and speak with justice, He is telling us that when we speak with justice, it includes standing up for the rights of the masakin, standing up for the rights of the orphans. Now, because the Quran mentions orphans and those who are masakin, it does not necessarily mean we limit these values to only these two categories. Because these were the two categories of people which were there at the time of in Mecca and Medina when these verses of the Quran were revealed. So we have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about those who are deprived of these things. And saying that when we speak for justice, we be from among those who encourage people to feed the orphans and who encourage people to help the poor. Amma ba'd. Today's topic is social justice. Social justice is probably the most important issue of our times. Whether it is in the United States, whether it is in the Muslim world, whether it is in the Arab world, wherever we see social justice is the most important issue. Today in the United States, we are suffering from things which undermine social justice. Now let me first try and see if I can contrast between what is justice and what is social justice. The word justice is a bigger category, it is a broader category. It encompasses so many things more than social justice. For example, if you have been robbed and you complain to the police and they come to your help, that is part of justice. If somebody in your family has been hurt and you are looking for punishment, recompensation, you are looking for justice. When people have been kicked out of their homelands, you're looking for justice. And in Islam, justice is one of the most important values. There are two values which are the most cherished according to Islamic law, according to the Quran, according to the tradition of the Prophet. One is individualistic and the other is communal. The individualistic value which is most cherished is taqwa. It is God consciousness. It is fear of God, which includes tawheed. You cannot be God conscious without being aware and believing that there is one and only one God. And the value that comes next to it often is prescribed as justice or adl. But you must also remember that adl is a communal value and taqwa is an individual value. So it means each of its categories, they are both primary values. So from an individual perspective, if you are a believer, if you are a Muslim, then the most important value is taqwa. And as a community for us, the most important value is justice, because the manifestation of justice, the conduct of justice in our society is a measure of our taqwa, or a measure of our belief, or the extent to which we are God conscious is measured. There is one particular type of hadith which I often quote, called hadith al-Qudsi. This is a tradition in which the Prophet ﷺ essentially paraphrases God and says that God said. So often hadith will start with Qala Rasulullah, Qala Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Prophet ﷺ said that God said such and such thing. So one of the most important or widely quoted hadith al-Qudsi, which you will find in Sahih Muslim and then other secondary collections like Riyadh al-Salihin, etc. God says, "O my slaves, I have forbidden injustice for myself and forbid it also for you. So avoid being unjust to one another." So God starts by speaking by justice, is saying that, "O my servants, O people who believe in me, know that I have forbidden justice to myself." So God will not do injustice himself. And he expects us to follow his sunnah, to follow his tradition, to follow his example and not do injustice among each other. That is the most important hadith tradition that you find. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رَسُولَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْمِيزَانَ لِيَقُومَ النَّاسَ بِالْقِسْطِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something so profound in just two lines, that the entire purpose of this community, the creation of humanity, is revealed in this. God says, "I have sent you prophets with clear signs." لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رَسُولَنَا. We have sent you prophets. بِالْبَيِّنَةِ. Bayina, like the surah Bayina. Bayinat are clear signs, so there is no doubt about them. There is no ambiguity in what these prophets have brought. They are not metaphorical. They are not allegorical, they are mubin, they are clear. So God has sent very clear signs with all these prophets that he has sent, and Mahum al-Kitab, and with them he has sent the books. So the books, we know the books that he has sent, the Torah, the Bible, the Psalms of David, and the Quran. So God has sent us a series of prophets with clear signs, and with them he has revealed to us books and al-Mizan. So those of us, there are some people who believe that we should only follow the Quran. For them, here is a clear message that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself is saying that it's not just that I sent you a book or books. I have sent you the example of my prophets as clear signs that you should follow. But it's not just the Quran and the example of the prophet. He also said, "I have sent you a mizan." This sense among human beings to be able to distinguish between what is just and what is unjust. So God has sent us prophets to give us clear signs. He has sent us books. The Quran was sent as guidance to those who fear God, who believe in God. So he has sent us books as guidance, and he has sent us the mizan, the capacity to judge, to balance. And why did he do that? لِيَقُومَ النَّاسِ بِالْقِسْطِ, to establish among humanity justice. The word that is often used in Arabic for justice is adl. And in fact, one of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's names, or one of God's names, is al-adl, justice. When I was researching that, I found out that actually It doesn't appear either in the Quran and the Hadith. It appears only in the long Hadith, which lists all the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you will find the word Al-Adl. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is justice. We're not saying Adil, one who does justice. We're saying He's Adl. He is Himself justice, just like He's Salam. Just as He's peace, He's also justice. So the whole purpose of guidance, the whole purpose of religion, therefore, is to establish justice in society. That is the purpose for which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent us. And so when you read any Islamic legal books, pick up books of Sharia and try to understand what is the fundamental purpose of Islamic law or divine law, is to establish justice. Is to establish justice, to treat people. There are dozens of verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells people to treat each other with justice, and commands even the Prophet ﷺ and others that when you judge between people, do it with justice. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that the purpose of creation of the community is justice. Now there are two verses in the Quran which will help us understand the difference between justice and social justice. One of the easiest examples to understand social justice is take the case of the Palestinians. The Palestinians who live in Gaza and Palestinians who live in West Bank, they are deprived of their fundamental freedom. They are oppressed militarily under occupation. Thousands of them are routinely killed. They have no right to travel, etc. They are in need of justice. What is being done to them is injustice. Sometimes the Quran uses the word oppression, zulm, as synonymous with justice, injustice. So what the Palestinians need is justice from the injustices they suffer. But if you contrast that to the Arabs who live in Israel, even they are suffering, even though they are citizens of Israel. They are much, much better off than the Palestinians who live in West Bank and Gaza, because constitutionally they are equal citizens. They can vote, they can even run for parliament, they are members of parliament. The Israeli parliament actually has a mosque in the parliament, one of the few parliaments in the world which had a mosque on its premises for the Muslim Arabs to pray, the members of the parliament. But they're still deprived of equal access to what the state can provide. Their children do not go to the same kinds of schools. They do not have equal access to loans, equal access to power. This lack of equal access from a state which is supposed to be democratic is the absence of social justice. So when we demand justice for Palestinians and social justice for those who live inside Israel. So when we look at the United States, we are demanding social justice. When we find that there is racial inequity, when Islamophobia becomes dominant and we combat Islamophobia in this country, we are fighting for social justice. We are arguing that all citizens in this country be treated equal under the law. When we are calling for the current election of Canada has created lots of exciting things for especially people who are of immigrant background. They have 4 persons of Sikh origin who are in the parliament. The defense minister is a Sikh who wears a turban, etc. There are Muslims in the parliament and also in the cabinet. Now what that is demonstrating is the positive side of diversity, the inclusiveness of the government. When government becomes inclusive and everybody, regardless of their race and their economic status, has access to what the state can give, then we say there is social justice and there is diversity. So absence of diversity, absence of equal access to benefits that a government can provide is injustice. And that is the social justice that we are trying to fight. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah An-Nisa, verse 135, the chapter is 4. This is a very prominent verse. Every Sharia book starts with this word when it talks about justice. The very definition of justice in Islam is more or less shaped by the understanding of this verse. And if you go to Harvard Law School, right in the lobby of the Harvard Law School, there's a big poster with this ayah from Surah An-Nisa. And it says that this is, according to Harvard law professors, the most profoundest religious expression of justice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu kunu khawamina bil khisti shuhada'a lillahi walau ala anfusikum awil walidain wal aqrabin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, O you who believe, be firm and persistently standing up for justice. The word that is often used in the Quran in this context is bil-qisti, with justice, not adl. And I think it is probably more appropriate for us in future that when we talk about social justice, that is what we are talking about, bil-qisti. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that those of you who believe, stand firmly and persistently for justice, and shuhada'a lillahi, and as witnesses to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So God is saying that when you stand up for justice, firmly and persistently, that is the way to witness God. When you say, I've taken shahada, it is not enough just to say, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. That is not enough. When you stand up for justice, that is the true manifestation of shahada. You are witnessing God by standing firmly and persistently. This is very important. Not just episodically. One day you do it, the other day you take off. There's no weekend break from standing up for justice. This is really a very serious matter, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is here and elsewhere equating standing up for justice with bearing witness for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He's saying that it is, and stand up for justice for even if it is against yourself. Even if it is against yourself. وَلَوْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِكُمْ, even if it is against yourself. And while I was reading this ayah, I suddenly realized that in the American context, Muslims cannot take the fifth. You cannot plead the Fifth Amendment by saying that I cannot answer this question because I will incriminate myself, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, stand up for justice even if it is against yourself. And even if it's against yourself, and even if it is against your relatives, which means the rule that says that a wife need not testify against her husband, this creates a little moral problem. And the moral problem would be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, be firm for justice even if it is against yourself, and even if it is against your relatives. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says that it does not matter whether you are rich or whether you are poor. It does not matter whether you're rich. Both are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we stand up for justice, we stand up for justice for those who are rich, for those who are poor. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in this ayah that do not allow your pursuit of self-interest. Do not allow the pursuit of فَلَا تَتَّبِعُونَ الْهَوَىٰ. Do not allow the pursuit of your self-interest, your desires, to compel you to act unjustly. It is a very profound moral claim. That's why I think it baffles so many moral and ethical philosophers. Stand up for justice even if it is against yourself. Stand up for justice even if it is against your relatives. And stand up for justice even if it's against your self-interest. In this age of nation states where national interest is so important a moral principle, this is mind-boggling assertion of principles against politics. You must stand up for justice against yourself, against your family, and even if it means against your interest. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that I can see what you do. But in Surah, in Surah Ma'idah, the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's very interesting. I would recommend that you go and look at these two ayahs side by side, because of the way they are linguistically very beautiful. They are say roughly in similar things, but they say slightly differently. I don't have the time to dwell on the linguistic aspect of these two. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu kunu khawamina lillahi shuhada'a bil qist. For example, in the previous ayah, in Surah Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, stand firmly for justice as witnesses to God. And in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, stand firmly for God as witnesses to justice. And that is, to me, mind-boggling, because technically, from a literary perspective, God is equating standing for Him or witnessing for Him as witnessing justice as two is the same thing. And it doesn't confuse you if you also realize that the word al-adl also means Allah. So when you stand for al-adl, you're standing for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَن تَعْدِلُوا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that stand up for justice even for those people whom you hate. That is where the whole story is complete. In Surah Nisa, 4:135, God is saying, stand up for justice even against those whom you love. That is yourself, your interests, your family. And in Surah Ma'idah is saying, and stand up for justice even for those whom you hate. In Surah Nisa, God is saying, stand up for justice and do not allow your self-interest to corrupt justice. And in Surah Ma'idah is saying, stand up for justice and do not allow your hatred of others to corrupt your conduct of justice. Basically, He's leaving you no room to act in a fashion which is not just or fair. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then continues, but before that I want to give you 2 or 3 examples of what is the problem in this country as far as social justice is concerned. For example, the average wealth of non-white people in this country, net worth, which means everything that you owe to the bank minus everything that you have saved, net worth, what is the positive in your account. The average net worth of non-white people in this country is $21,000. MashaAllah, I know some of you must be making more than that in a week. The average net worth of African Americans in this country is $11,000. That is the net worth. It can be very frightening. The net worth of African Americans in this country is $11,000. The average net worth of white people, well, what is 11 times 11? 121. 11 times 12, 132. Nearly 14 times the average net worth of black people. It's over 140,000. So the average net worth of a white family is 14 times the average net worth of a black family in this country. And that is what we mean when we say social inequity. If there is so much of a wealth gap, and let me tell you, if you look at the graph of the wealth gap, it is steadily increasing since Civil War. There is no downward blip at all. The income gap continues to increase. Even the current recession that we have suffered has affected people of different races very differently. Nearly 44% of African American families lost their jobs and their net worth, where only 10 to 11% of white people lost their worth. That is the sign. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala therefore made zakat obligatory on Muslims. We are supposed to pay zakat. If a society pays zakat, this income gap will not exist, at least to this level. That is why when you translate the word zakat into English, when people ask you, what is zakat? Do not, for God's sake, say charity. It is not charity. That is sadaqah. Zakat, the best way to translate the word zakat into English is to say distributive justice. That is what it is from an economic perspective. We are trying to create justice in the distribution of wealth in society. That is why you have zakat. So you can't have inequity. Let me give you one frightening wealth. 3% of Americans own 54% of all wealth in this country. Everything that is there in America, half of it, more than half of it is owned by 3%, and 90% of Americans own less than 25% of America. That is an inequity which we need to address. From an Islamic perspective, it is untenable, it is simply unacceptable that there is so much inequality. Sometimes if you have time, go and read the traditions that some of the Sahaba who talked about the income inequality. They felt that we could not have an Islamic society if there is income inequality. The purpose of having an Islamic society is so there should be nobody who will be eligible for zakat. There is no masakin. The police treatment in this country of people across races is unacceptable. For example, white people in this country use more drugs. There are more black people, 3 times more black people in prison for the crimes on drugs, non-violent crimes of drugs than white people. That is an act of social injustice which must be addressed. And you know what? We live in this country. We are Muslims and we are Americans. And if you think that God is only going to ask you about what donations you made to the Masjid and what contributions you did not make to the state of Delaware, your community in America, then you are very much in surprise. because none of these ayats have exceptions. Wherever you are in a society, you have to stand up to justice if you are a true believer. On the issue of poverty, 47 million people in the United States live in a state of poverty, which is 15% of the population. Among children, 21% of all American children live in poverty. That is 16 million children. And one of the biggest problems of poverty in this country is lack of health care, lack of insurance. Lack of health care leads to obesity, leads to death, leads to all kinds of things, including crime. And even that, poverty is unequally distributed. About 15% Muslims live in poverty and about 26% African Americans live in poverty. The third kind of Islamophobia, prejudice that we see in America, which compromises the quality of social justice in this country, is Islamophobia. 135 of all religious hate crimes, I guess. We average about 13 to 14% of all religious hate crimes in America are done against Muslims. Now, if you just look at the number and say 13%, that's not a lot. Other people are getting hit. Most of the hate crimes are committed against Jews. About 60% are anti-Semitic crimes, and 13 to 14% are Islamophobic. But you must recognize these are FBI data, which means these are cases which are actually active, reported and logged in FBI's records. So even according to FBI, the 14% of all hate crimes, 13 to 14%, are Islamophobic. But what is shocking about this data is that Muslims are less than 1% of the population. We are less than 1% of the population, and we get the share of 13% of hate crimes. This is also a very scary part. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He expands the Muslim consciousness to such an extent that they begin to see and understand, especially if you read Surah Ma'un, all of you probably know it by heart, that praying is not enough. Standing up for justice, standing up for the poor is as important as praying. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. If you read Surah Rahman, there is one very beautiful ayah in Surah Rahman. Well, all the ayahs in Surah Rahman are beautiful. But for today's purpose, this ayah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا تُقْصِرُوا الْمِيزَانَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, establish وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ, establish justice in a very appropriate fashion and do not tinker with the balance. Now often commentators have used it only in terms of measurement. They don't mess with the little balance that you use to measure weight when you're selling stuff. But that's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this entire creation in a just order. Everything is in its place, everything knows its function, and everything is performing its function as ordained by God except human beings. Because we have the freedom to choose not to be just, to choose not to act according to His wishes. And that is where this order is coming, that God is saying that in the entire management of this cosmos, I have given you only the socio-political sphere of humanity on earth, that's it. And in that little area, I want you to act with justice and do not mess with institutions, do not tinker it. And this is what we need to talk about, is the institutionalized racism, institutionalized prejudice, institutionalized inequalities which are there in our system. Which means that even if you do as well as anybody else, the institutions are so designed that people of a particular race, people of a particular religion, people of a particular community will be marginalized, will suffer. And that is exactly what God is saying in Surah Ar-Rahman. Do not mess with institutions in such a way that you cannot achieve justice in society. And that is why it is very important for us. Every Jummah, nearly everywhere, we end the khutbahs with this ayah, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم, إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان. establish justice with beauty, establish justice with charity. Sometimes the word ihsan is translated as charity, sometimes as beauty, sometimes as worshipping Allah as if you see Him. But in this context, if you look at the word ihsan as charity, and then you just realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to add and implement justice with charity, justice with beauty, and that is social justice. So every khutbah that Muslims hear ends with a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to establish social justice, and we don't think of it. When we try to understand the Quran in the context of our lives, it's earth-shattering. I've heard many khutbahs on justice, I've read many articles on justice and books. But while I was preparing for the khutbah, this is the first time I made this connection between the ayah in Surah Nisa and the ayah in Surah Ma'idah. I was walking around my study as if I was floating in air. It just hit me so profoundly that we're looking at these two verses often in isolation, but when you put them together, you will understand first that the word Bilqis is so much more important as a concept for social justice, and number two, that we stand up for justice even if it means undermining our own self-interest, and we stand up for justice even if it means advancing the interests of our enemies. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us all the wisdom to understand His book, understand His message, to understand our purpose in this society. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us the conviction and the courage to stand up for justice as witnesses to God in our society. Today we have some of my students and friends from the University of Delaware who are visiting. I welcome them, and I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives them hidayah, gives them taqwa, and above all makes them soldiers and warriors for social justice. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون وأقيموا الصلاة.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
سووا صفوفكم فإن تسوية الصفوف من تمام الصلاة. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله يا أيها فأبين أن يحملنها وأشفقن منها وحملها الإنسان إنه كان ظلوما جهولا ليعذب الله المنافقين والمنافقات والمشركين والمشركات ويتوب الله على المؤمنين والمؤمنات وكان الله غفورا رحيما. الله سمع الله لمن حمده. الله الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان. الله سمع الله لمن حمده. الله 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 أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.